In a house faded by fortune and haunted by pride, a daughter is bartered like fine porcelain, her silence purchased, her future sealed. He is Count Lucian Redwick, a man who trusts reputation more than hearts. She is Agnes Ashworth, the woman rumoured barren, the secret no one dares to test. Tonight, duty weds desire in a cold room where vows sound like verdicts, and somewhere behind a locked gaze, something begins to burn. A past mistake is about to knock at the door. A choice, obedience or truth, will not wait. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what do you crave most in a period romance? Slow blooming passion, sharp scandal, or redemption hard won? London, England, the autumn of 1863. The city's fog hung low and heavy over the rooftops, seeping like sorrow into the bones of old stone and worn velvet. But it was not the soot-blackened streets of Mayfair or the damp avenues of Kensington that whispered of tragedy. It was the decaying corridors of the Ashworth estate, where a daughter was being bartered like fine porcelain in a market of desperation. Agnes Ashworth stood in the drawing room where time itself seemed reluctant to linger. The once opulent room bore the stains of faded fortune. Threadbare damask curtains, barely catching the grey light, gilt-framed portraits of solemn ancestors blurred with dust, and a marble hearth, long cold. She stood near the tall window, her gloved hands clasped before her, as still as one of the statues that flanked the staircase below. Outside, the branches of the elm trees scraped against the panes like the fingers of forgotten ghosts. She was 24, but in that moment she felt centuries old. "Do not mistake this for betrayal," her mother said sharply, seated on the brocade settee with her back as rigid as her tone. Lady Honoria Ashworth wore black silk bombazine, her lace cuffs yellowed with time, her hair scraped into a severe knot streaked with iron. "It is salvation, for you, and for this house." Agnes turned to face her. Her hazel eyes, luminous and wide, shimmered with something unspoken. Not resistance. Not obedience, something far older. Her father, Sir Benedict, hovered near the fireplace, though no flame burned there. His waistcoat strained over a paunch grown from port and penance. His gaze remained fixed on the hearth, as though he might find absolution in the ashes. The Redwick title is ancient, the estate vast. The Count, he faltered, tugging at his cravat. The Count is a man of serious reputation. It is an honor. An honor. Agnes echoed the words softly, without emotion. They sounded like a dirge. Lady Honoria's mouth tightened. "There will be no dramatics. This is not some Gothic novel, Agnes. You will be Countess Redwick before the month ends. Do your duty. Be obedient. Be silent." The door opened behind them, and with it came a change in the air, a sudden hush, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Count Lucian Redwick entered as one accustomed to being the centre of gravity in any space. He was tall, broad of shoulder, his black frock coat sculpted to his frame with military precision. His dark hair, combed back to reveal a severe widow's peak, gleamed with pomade. A thin line of beard framed a jaw that looked carved in granite, and his eyes, grey as winter slate, swept over the room like a judgment. He did not bow. He merely inclined his head, just enough to acknowledge those present, but not so far as to lower himself. "Lady Honoria, Sir Benedict." His voice was low even, and so perfectly unbothered it chilled the room further. His gaze slid to Agnes, and paused. It was not a look of admiration, nor of curiosity. It was the look one gave a ledger before signing away a sum too large to feel real. "So," he said, "this is the girl." Agnes did not flinch, though her fingers curled slightly within her gloves. "This is my daughter," Lady Honoria replied, rising. "Agnes has been raised to be dutiful and discreet. She knows her place." Lucian's eyes flicked back to Agnes. "I was informed she is barren." The words fell like a stone into a frozen lake. Sir Benedict shifted uncomfortably. "There is no medical confirmation, of course, only rumours. From her mother's side, perhaps. We can't be sure." "It suits me," Lucian interrupted coldly. "I have no use for an heir. I need a wife in name, one who will not trouble herself with sentiment." Agnes inhaled once, deeply, then stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was calm as a winter wind. "I will not trouble you, my lord. I am very good at being silent." A flicker passed through his expression. Perhaps amusement, perhaps surprise, but it vanished before it could be named. He turned to the table where the contract had been laid out. Without fanfare, he removed a gold pen from his inner coat pocket and signed the paper. Lady Honoria did the same, her signature sharp and proud. Then Agnes. Her name flowed in careful script across the parchment, though her heart had long ceased to beat in any rhythm resembling freedom. She had signed away her name for a title she did not want, a future not her own. When it was done, Lucian offered her his arm. She took it. His sleeve was made of the finest wool, and his skin beneath radiated a strange heat. But there was no warmth in his posture. His body remained distant, the gesture purely ceremonial. As they walked through the corridor toward the waiting carriage, a figure appeared at the edge of the shadows. Lady Beatrice Redwick, draped in deep green silk and jet beads that caught no light, watched them like a vulture sizing up an uncertain feast. Her cane tapped once against the stone floor. "She has a fragile look," she murmured to Lucian as they passed. "If this one fails, you may still consider the Montrose girl. Strong breeding there, and fertile as a spring lamb." Lucian did not respond, but Agnes felt his arm tighten ever so slightly beneath her hand. Outside, the carriage waited. The mist curled around its wheels like a living thing. Agnes stepped inside, her face calm, her spine straight. As the door shut behind her, she allowed herself one breath, just one, that did not belong to duty. She would be Countess Redwick before the month ended. A wife by contract. A woman deemed empty. But inside her, something vast and wordless stirred. Not fear, not sorrow, something else, something that refused to die. And London, grey and watching, closed around them all. Redwick Hall stood like a sentinel against the rising mist, its tall chimneys exhaling faint curls of smoke into the grey sky. Surrounded by acres of solemn yew trees and a long frost-bitten drive, the estate loomed not as a home, but as a verdict. Its stone facade bore the weight of centuries, its windows casting a silent gaze on all who dared cross its threshold. For Agnes Ashworth Redwick, it was not a house of welcome. It was a fortress where warmth had long since perished. She arrived just before dusk. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel like brittle bones, and when the door opened, the wind met her first. It crept beneath her cloak, biting at her cheeks, pulling at the edge of her bonnet like a warning whispered from the trees. She stepped down alone, her gloved hand touching the iron railing of the front stair, as if to steady not her body, but her soul. No husband awaited her on the steps, no hand outstretched in symbolic greeting. Only the butler, a stiff man in a too-perfect coat, bowed with a motion practiced more for ceremony than sincerity. "Welcome to Redwick Hall, madam." The word felt foreign. She stepped into the entrance hall, where chandeliers of unlit crystal loomed above her like frozen rain. The air inside was colder than the autumn wind. The walls were panelled in dark oak, carved with coats of arms and faceless cherubs. Along the grand staircase, portraits of men with severe brows and unsmiling mouths stared down in eternal judgment. Her arrival stirred no flutter of servants, no eager voices or hurrying feet. Redwick Hall was not a place of laughter or life. It was a mausoleum in velvet and stone. "Her rooms are prepared," came a voice from the shadows. Agnes turned. Lady Beatrice Redwick emerged like a wraith from the corridor, her cane tapping against the marble with deliberate slowness. Draped in a gown of forest green brocade, her figure was imposing, not by size, but by presence. Her iron-grey hair was tucked beneath a lace cap, and a string of jet beads encircled her thick neck like mourning armor. "You will find everything as it should be," the older woman said, her eyes scanning Agnes from bonnet to hem. "The Count is not in residence. He prefers the city during the season." Agnes inclined her head. "I understand. I do hope you do," Beatrice continued, her gaze sharp. "Redwick does not tolerate disorder, nor disappointment. We are not a house of passions or weakness. We are a house of lineage. I am not here to disturb that, Agnes replied softly. Lady Beatrice's lips curled, not in amusement, but in something colder. See that you do not. The rooms prepared for her were on the east wing, far from the marital chamber she never entered, and from the drawing rooms that once held music and youth, but now echoed only with dust and footsteps. Her bedchamber was large and high-ceilinged, its tapestries faded, its fireplace unlit. The bed was vast and cold, a monument more than a comfort. The maid who greeted her, petite, freckled, and barely older than a child, curtsied nervously. I'm Clara, milady. I'll be serving you. Thank you, Clara, Agnes murmured, offering the girl a smile that did not come easily to her lips anymore. Have they lit a fire? Clara shook her head. They weren't told you'd need one. Agnes removed her gloves slowly, her hands trembling from the cold. Then let us surprise them. That night she slept beneath thick velvet covers with her thoughts as company. Lucian did not return, nor did he write, and in the days that followed, Redwick Hall revealed its true nature. Meals were taken alone. The grand dining room, with its long, polished table that could seat 30, now hosted a single place setting. The food was fine but flavorless, prepared without care. No one asked what she preferred. No one spoke unless spoken to. The servants moved like ghosts, trained in the art of invisibility. Lucian's absence was not remarked upon. It was as if the house itself had learned to live without him, or perhaps it had been built that way. The whispers began within a fortnight. She heard them in the kitchens, caught them in the folds of closed doors. She's barren, they said. Poor girl. No wonder the Count keeps to London. The house will pass to his cousin at this rate. Cold as marble, that one, no fire in her. Agnes said nothing. Not to the servants, not to Lady Beatrice, who continued to observe her like a hawk eyeing a wounded sparrow. But she heard every word, and each syllable lodged beneath her ribs like slivers of glass. She took refuge in the gardens, or what remained of them. The rose beds were overgrown, the fountains dry, the hedges wild. But the silence there was different. It was not contemptuous. It was simply still. Clara followed her loyally, often with a wool shawl and a flask of tea. Over time, the girl's shyness melted into warmth, and Agnes began to feel for the first time in Redwyke Hall that she was not entirely alone. I found something in the old gardener's cottage, Clara whispered one morning, handing her a leather-bound book of pressed flowers and planting charts. Perhaps it will help. Agnes clutched it to her chest. It already has. In the village beyond the gates, she discovered something even more unexpected. People in need. Families whose roofs leaked, whose chimneys had not seen coal in months. Tenants whose rents rose though repairs never came. Children with bare feet and mothers with hollow eyes. She began visiting them, quietly, carefully. She used coins saved from her dowry, which Lady Beatrice did not know she possessed. She brought baskets of bread and wool, sent word to a physician when illness struck, listened when grief had no one else to hear it. And slowly they began to look at her not as the Count's distant wife, but as a woman with eyes that truly saw them. Lucian returned unexpectedly one evening, 3 weeks after she arrived. Agnes was in the parlour, seated by the fire, embroidering in silence. The doors opened without warning, and he entered without apology. He looked different, not in form, still tall, still severe, but there was weariness beneath his eyes, as though even stone could erode. "Lady Redwyke," he greeted. "My lord," she replied, rising with quiet poise. "I assume the arrangements have been adequate." "They have." He paused, then stepped closer, though not too close. "If there is anything you require, you may inform Lady Beatrice." "I will inform Clara." His eyes narrowed. "You've taken to speaking directly to the help. I find honesty easier with those who do not pretend to care." The silence stretched. Something flickered between them, unspoken, unreadable. A single heartbeat suspended in breath. Lucian looked away first. "You are..." Different than I expected. I am different than what you were told." He said nothing more. With a curt nod, he left the room, his boots echoing against the marble floor like the retreating drums of a silent war. Later that night, Agnes stood at her window, looking out over the darkened estate. She could see the faint glow of the village beyond, the smudge of chimney smoke curling upward like a prayer unanswered. Behind her, the fire crackled softly. In her hand, the embroidery needle stilled. Her chest rose with a breath not of sorrow, but of resolve. She was not a bride. She was not a mistress. She was not barren of heart. She was Agnes Ashworth Redwick, and the house that ignored her would soon remember her name. The first snow of the season had fallen that morning, veiling the gardens of Redwick Hall in a hush of white. The yew trees glittered with frost, the fountain stood frozen mid-pour, and the gravel paths were swept to perfection in anticipation of the evening's event. Inside, however, no such peace reigned. Servants rushed through the corridors with trays and candles, candelabras gleamed with fresh wax, and the scent of pine and beeswax filled the air. Redwick Hall was coming alive, not for joy, but for spectacle. Agnes stood in front of her mirror, unmoving as Clara fastened the last hook of her gown. It was a deep sapphire silk, carefully chosen from the Ashworth trunks. The bodice clung to her frame modestly, with just enough curve to whisper femininity. The sleeves brushed her wrists with delicate lace, and a thin pearl necklace rested at the hollow of her throat like a promise never made. Her chestnut hair had been twisted into a low knot, with loose tendrils curling near her cheeks, softening the quiet defiance in her eyes. "You look lovely, milady," Clara whispered, her voice reverent. Agnes said nothing. Her reflection stared back at her, not with admiration, but with endurance. This was not a dress of celebration. It was armor. The ball had not been her idea. Lady Beatrice, always eager to parade the illusion of perfection, had decided it was time for the Countess to fulfill her role publicly. "Let them see her," she had told Lucian with a smile as cold as cut crystal. "Let them wonder why she has failed." Now the guests began to arrive. Carriages lined the long drive, their wheels crunching snow, their doors opening to reveal jewels and powdered shoulders and feathers that brushed the ceilings. The music began to swell from the ballroom, violins and pianoforte, a waltz that sounded both elegant and hollow. Agnes descended the grand staircase alone. Her gloved hand grazed the banister, and for a moment all conversations fell silent as eyes turned upward. The Countess had arrived. They looked at her the way one might regard a porcelain figure on a shelf, fragile, cold, exquisite in her stillness. The women's gazes were sharp, appraising, the men's disinterested. Whispers rose like smoke. "She hasn't quickened, has she? Such delicate features. Shame they come with no legacy. She doesn't speak much. Redwick prefers quiet things." She glided past them, her face serene, her heart armored. A glass of white wine was placed in her hand. She held it without sipping. Lucian appeared moments later. He was dressed in formal black, his waistcoat embroidered with silver thread, a single sapphire pin in his cravat. As always, he looked untouchable, imperial in stillness, unreadable in expression. He made no move to greet her, merely offered his arm for the traditional opening dance. Agnes placed her hand lightly upon it. Their fingers did not brush. Their bodies remained inches apart. They waltzed once, surrounded by a crowd that watched for cracks. Agnes moved with grace, her steps flawless. Lucian guided her without faltering, his hand on her waist firm but distant. When the final note fell, he inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, my lady." She nodded in return. "Of course, my lord." He left the floor without another word. Alone once more, Agnes retreated from the ballroom, past the gilded columns and ornate mirrors, until the music was a muffled memory behind her. She walked down a quiet corridor lined with portraits, their painted eyes following her retreat, and slipped into the conservatory, where the cold crept in beneath the glass dome and clung to the leaves of potted palms. The moonlight streamed in silver beams through the glass panes, catching in the frost that traced the windows like lace. She found a corner near the ivy, far from the oil lamps, and stood in stillness, the wineglass still in her hand, untouched. Then she heard it. Voices, low, male, too close to ignore. She remained frozen, the foliage shielding her. The voices belonged to Lucian and Edward Fairfax, his oldest friend and frequent guest. The marriage was political, not personal, Lucian said, his tone casual, careless. I had assumed that much, Edward replied. Still, I thought she would be different. She is quiet, composed, but barren, as expected. A pause. It suits me. Agnes did not move. The words echoed like cannon fire in her ears. I have no interest in fathering children, Lucian continued, and certainly not with a woman so frigid. I sometimes wonder if she bleeds ice. Edward let out a half-laugh, uneasy. You're cruel tonight. She feels nothing. I suspect she was born that way. The laughter faded. Footsteps moved away. The voices disappeared into the shadows. But Agnes remained. The wineglass trembled in her hand. Her breath caught in her chest. And then the sound of shattering. Crystal exploded in her palm, the stem breaking beneath her grip. Red welled instantly from her hand, staining the snow-white fichu at her wrist. She looked down, stunned by the pain. A single drop of blood hit the tiled floor with a soft, accusing sound. She turned and walked away, the shards falling to the floor behind her like glass tears. She did not look back. Clara found her in the bedchamber minutes later, pale, trembling, her hand wrapped in a silk scarf, darkened with blood. "Oh, milady, what happened?" she gasped, rushing forward. "I broke a glass," Agnes replied softly, "and something else." Clara cleaned the wound with gentle precision, her eyes wet with unshed tears as she stitched the deepest cut with a curved needle and steady hands. "You should rest," she whispered. "You need warmth." "I need silence," Agnes said. Then, after a pause, "but not the kind they force upon me." Clara hesitated, then reached into her apron and produced a small, leather-bound notebook. "I was going to give this to you for Christmas, but I think you should begin now." Agnes took the book with her uninjured hand. The leather was warm from Clara's pocket. Blank pages waited within. "What would I write?" she asked. "Write what no one sees," Clara replied, "so you do not forget who you are." That night, with one hand bandaged and the other holding a pen, Agnes sat at her writing desk beneath a flickering oil lamp. The shadows danced across the walls, like echoes of the evening's cruelty. She opened the journal and wrote the date. Then, with quiet fire, she began, "They believe me barren of heart, of body, of soul. But the blood on my hand says otherwise. I feel, I burn, I endure. I am not made of ice, and I will not vanish." The earth of Redwick had long been forgotten beneath layers of moss, tangled vines and weeds that wound their way through the crumbling stone borders, like time itself reclaiming what once belonged to order. The formal gardens, which in a more luminous era had rivaled any in the county, had decayed into silence and neglect, mirroring in their slow ruin the mansion that towered above them. But Agnes saw what others did not. By early spring, when the snow had melted into memory and the soil turned damp and fragrant beneath the thawing sun, she began her work. She came to the gardens each morning before the first bell rang through the halls, sleeves rolled, gloves dirtied, skirts pinned above her ankles to avoid the mud. Clara often trailed behind her with a basket of tools and biscuits wrapped in cloth, her soft eyes watching with admiration and worry. Agnes spoke little. She did not need to. Her hands became fluent in the language of roots and thorns, her silence broken only by the rhythm of pruning shears and the scraping of iron trowels through packed earth. She dug until her back ached, until her hands were calloused. She cleared paths where none had walked in years. Roses long believed dead bloomed again beneath her care, shy at first, then proud, brightening the neglected corners like forgotten memories pushing through grief. The servants whispered of her strange ritual. "She spends hours there," they said, "all that silence, as if she were praying to the ground." Lady Beatrice observed from her drawing-room window with a frown that deepened each day, her fan fluttering against her bosom like a caged bird. Agnes did not care. The garden gave her something Redwick had never offered: purpose. It asked nothing of her lineage, nor her womb, nor her silence. It simply accepted her. And in its slow return to life, she began to feel something inside her stirring too, something quiet, unfamiliar, alive. It was on the 7th day of rain that Lucian returned. He had been absent for over a week, tending to estate matters in Northumberland. His arrival was unannounced, but unmistakable, the echo of hooves against wet stone, the doors flung open, the scent of travel and storm trailing behind him like a second coat. Agnes was outside, beneath the veil of mist and drizzle, kneeling in a patch of soil near the southern hedge where lilies once thrived. Her gown was damp, clinging to her calves. Her gloves were soaked through, her bonnet set aside in the wheelbarrow nearby. Rain fell steadily, soaking her shoulders and the curls that had escaped her braid. She did not hear him approach. Only when his voice cut through the rain did she lift her head. "This is what has become of the Countess of Redwick." His tone was neither amused nor curious, only sharp, as if her presence offended the symmetry of the landscape. Agnes rose slowly, wiping her gloved hands on the apron tied at her waist. "I might ask the same of the Earl of Redwick," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You vanished. The house made no mention of your return. I need not announce myself to my own household." "No," she said, "you need not." He stepped closer, the rain plastering his dark coat to his frame. His face was expressionless, save for a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You've become the talk of the servants," he said, "digging in the mud like a laborer, parading your melancholia through weeds." Her hands clenched at her sides. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think it is a performance," he said coldly, "one well-crafted to paint you as virtuous while I, conveniently, remain absent." She took a breath, deep and trembling. "I tend the gardens because they were dying. As is your marriage, if you failed to notice." A flicker crossed her face. It was not pain, not quite, but something colder. "No, my lord, I have not failed to notice." He hesitated then, just enough for her to see it, the briefest glint of uncertainty behind the steel. "You are not the only one who suffers in this union," he said, his voice lower. "Then say it plainly," she demanded, stepping toward him, the rain now falling harder between them. "Say what you mean. You find me barren, cold. You speak to others of my frigidness as if I were a winter wind to be endured." His eyes widened. "You were eavesdropping." "I was breathing," she said, her voice trembling now, "in a house that barely tolerates my presence. I heard what I was never meant to hear, but what I needed to." He looked away, the rain slipping from his hair in rivulets. "I said those things because I believed them to be true. And now?" she asked. "Do you still believe I feel nothing?" He turned back to her slowly. Rain streaked down his brow, his collar, the bridge of his nose. And for the first time, something raw passed between them, something without words. She stood before him, soaked through, her chest rising with the fire she had buried too long. "I may be barren, Lucian," she whispered, "but I am not hollow." The moment hovered, delicate, perilous. Then he stepped forward, sudden and unthinking. His hand found her waist. Her breath caught, and before either could stop it, his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was born of rain and rage and restraint. It spoke of things neither had allowed themselves to say. His hand trembled against the small of her back, her fingers curled in the wet fabric of his coat. It lasted only seconds, but when he pulled away, something had broken. Neither spoke. He looked at her once, truly looked, and then turned and walked back into the storm, disappearing into the mist like a man retreating from a battlefield he had lost. Agnes remained still, her body swaying with the weight of breath and thunder. That night, she wrote by candlelight, her bandaged hand still aching from the glass of weeks before. She did not write of the kiss. She wrote of the soil beneath her nails, of the way lilies return after years of neglect, of how rain both drowns and revives. She wrote of the silence between two people too proud to admit they are lonely. And in the margins, she scribbled one line over and over again until the ink bled through the page. "I'm not made of ice." Clara entered quietly near midnight, a tray of tea in hand. Agnes did not look up. "I think something has begun," she said. Clara nodded, setting the tray down. "In the garden?" she asked gently. Agnes closed the journal and blew out the candle. "In me," she whispered. The days following the storm took on a strange rhythm at Redwick Hall. The air held a quiet tension, as if the walls themselves remembered what had passed in the garden, though no one dared speak of it. Agnes moved through the halls with a new stillness, not born of submission, but of purpose. Within her, something had begun, delicate, mysterious, undeniable. And yet, she told no one but Clara. It was during the 3rd week of April that Agnes sat alone in her dressing room, the faint light of dawn washing over her face in shades of blue and silver. Her fingers rested over her abdomen, trembling not from fear, but from awe. The signs were faint but clear: the softness in her breasts, the fatigue that gripped her in the afternoons, the quiet flutter deep within, a sensation like the beating of wings beneath still water. "I must be certain," she whispered one morning. Clara, who stood at the window polishing the glass, turned immediately. "You know," she said gently, "and so do I." Agnes met her gaze through the mirror. "But he must not." The maid approached, hesitating. "He has a right to know, milady, even if—" "No," Agnes interrupted softly. "Not yet. He would not believe me. And if he did—" She trailed off, the thought too painful to finish. Clara looked at her mistress with the fierce protectiveness of one who had watched her suffer in silence for far too long. "Then I will help you keep it, as long as you need. But secrets, even when guarded by loyalty, have a scent. And Redwick Hall was a house that thrived on the perfume of scandal." Lady Beatrice Redwick had grown increasingly unsettled by the subtle change in her niece-in-law. She had always watched Agnes like a hawk surveying an unfamiliar creature, neither welcome nor dangerous, merely inconvenient. But lately, she had sensed something shift. There was a softness in Agnes's face, a tenderness in her gaze when her hand touched her belly absent-mindedly. Her appetite, though modest, had returned. Her colour improved. She walked with a certain slowness, delicate, graceful, almost regal. Beatrice's suspicion did not rest on joy. It landed on betrayal. And betrayal, in her world, could only come from one place. "I believe she's taken a lover," she announced one morning to her companion, a sharp-nosed widow from Surrey who shared her fondness for bitter tea and cruel conjecture. "There's no other explanation for her sudden glow." "A maid once told me she leaves the estate grounds," the woman replied. "Alone." Beatrice's thin lips curved in satisfaction. Then it is time she was reminded whose name she wears. It began with whispers in the corridor, soft at first, like draughts beneath closed doors. Servants murmured about long walks in the village, about a glance exchanged with the young vicar, about the stable boy who smiled too often. Agnes heard them all. Each whisper was a wound, yet she said nothing. Her body carried a truth the world had not earned the right to know. She had planned to wait another fortnight before speaking to Lucian. She had rehearsed the words, the tone, the calm expression. She hoped, against logic, against pride, that perhaps he would meet her news not with cruelty, but with something near acceptance. But fate at Redwyk rarely allowed for gentle timing. On a storm-lit afternoon, Agnes was summoned to the library. She walked there slowly, heart pounding, her hands folded over her abdomen. The corridor seemed longer than usual, the oil lamps flickering against the panelled walls like watchful eyes. Clara offered to come with her, but Agnes shook her head. "I must go alone." When she entered the room, Lucian stood by the window, his back to her. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting shadows that danced across the spines of law books and family records. Lady Beatrice sat by the fireplace, her expression severe, her walking stick resting beside her like a judge's gavel. "Sit," she said without warmth. Agnes remained standing. Lucian turned slowly. His eyes were cold, distant. "I have received news," he said, "that troubles me." "I'm certain you have," Agnes replied quietly. He stepped closer. "There are rumors circulating of your visits to the village, your activities." She met his gaze with unwavering calm. "Charity is not treason." "No," he said sharply, "but impropriety is." Agnes felt her heart stutter in her chest. Beatrice's voice cut the air like a knife. "There are whispers, Agnes, whispers that you have been seen in private conversation with men not of this household. Whispers that you are not the model of chastity one expects from a countess." Lucian's voice darkened. "Are you with child?" Agnes flinched. She could not speak. He stepped closer. "Answer me." "Yes," she whispered. For a moment, time stopped. The fire snapped. The wind moaned through the chimney, and then, "You lie," Lucian said, his voice thunderous. "You vile, conniving woman. You think to trap me with another man's child." Agnes recoiled as if struck. "No," she breathed. "It is yours," he laughed bitterly. "You said you were barren." "I never said that," she cried. "You chose to believe it." He turned away, fists clenched. Beatrice rose slowly, her eyes ablaze with triumph. "This is grounds for annulment," she said calmly. "A petition can be prepared. The Montrose girl is still unwed. She's younger and proven." Agnes's knees buckled. The room spun. Clara, who had waited outside the door, burst in just as Agnes collapsed to the floor, her pale hand clutching at the edge of the settee. Lucian moved instinctively, catching her before her head struck the rug. "Agnes," he muttered, his arms tightening around her. Her eyes fluttered. Beatrice watched, unmoved. "We need a physician," Clara said urgently. "Now." Lucian did not respond. He looked down at the woman in his arms, the woman he had accused, humiliated, doubted. Her face was waxen, her breath shallow, and yet beneath her trembling hand, her body carried the rhythm of life, of something waiting to be believed. He stared in silence, the storm outside echoing the one now inside him, and for the first time, doubt gripped him harder than pride. London, that great furnace of opulence and rot, burned hotter than ever that spring. Behind silken drapes and gilt mirrors, in parlours perfumed with bergamot and rumour, tongues wagged like pendulums in a clock wound by scandal. The city did not forget, and it never forgave, especially when the name Redwyke graced the lips of gossip-mongers like a jewel with a crack invisible to the naked eye. The Countess was with child, the Count refused to claim it, and the whispers began to bleed like ink through paper. No publication named Agnes outright, of course, not yet. The broadsheets merely hinted, with headlines steeped in implication. Viscountess cited in late condition while husband abroad, or country heirloom stirs question of lineage among aristocracy. But among the well-informed, there was no doubt. Redwyke Hall, once untouchable in its cold grandeur, had become entertainment for society's bored elite. Lucian Redwyke read each line with growing fury. He read them alone, behind the locked doors of his study, the fire burning low and the windows closed tight against the spring breeze. The newspapers lay scattered across his desk, crumpled at the corners, their ink smudged beneath the pressure of his hands. One sheet bore the outline of a wineglass where he had placed it down too hard. Another was torn straight through a paragraph that speculated on the identity of the child's possible father. He had already sent his valet to bribe 3 editors. One folded, 2 laughed. Redwyke pride had always been a fortress, but now it trembled under the weight of one woman's silence. Agnes had not spoken to the press. She had not run to her family. She had not sought sympathy. She had said only one thing to him the night she fainted: "It is yours." And yet, Lucian could not forget the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not even with sorrow, but with pity, as if he were the one bleeding. He summoned private agents, discreet men skilled in shadows. He demanded names, witnesses, any evidence that might expose the betrayal he could not bear to believe, but would rather prove than doubt. They returned with little. A note from a village doctor confirming her condition. A midwife who claimed no contact, an innkeeper who remembered Agnes visiting tenants near the chapel, alone, always carrying baskets, never meeting men in secrecy. Nothing. And yet Lucian's rage did not subside. He refused to see her. She, too, refused to beg. In her place, Lady Beatrice had taken to wielding the reins of control once more. Her letters flew from the manor like crows. She met with solicitors, asking delicate questions about annulment statutes, and drafted formal invitations to the Montrose estate. "We cannot," she told Lucian with steely calm, "be bound to a woman who carries shame like a badge and dares to call it honor. She has not confessed," he muttered. "She does not need to," Beatrice snapped. "Her silence is confession." Lucian had no reply to that, and so, 2 weeks later, Agnes Ashworth Redwick was sent away. The letter that arrived in her chamber bore no signature, only the Redwick seal. Its message was clear. The Countess will retire to the summer estate at Elmswood until her condition is resolved. This is for her protection. Travel will be arranged. Agnes read the letter with dry eyes. Clara wept in silence. No farewells were spoken. No hands clasped in protest. Agnes rose that morning as she always did, dressed herself in navy wool with her collar pinned high, and left Redwick Hall without a word. The carriage that awaited her was smaller than usual. The footmen were unfamiliar. By the time the gates closed behind her, she had become a rumor even in her own home. Elmswood, nestled deep in the country, was an estate known only to Redwyck kin. Isolated, surrounded by woodland and silence, it held none of the grandeur of the main house. Its furniture was older, its tapestries faded, its windows framed by ivy that curled like fingers around the stone. To Agnes, it felt like a refuge carved from exile. Each morning, she walked the edge of the woods, breathing the clean air with a calm she had never known. Her belly grew in quiet defiance, a gentle curve that she cradled at night beneath her nightgown, whispering to the life inside as if it were the only soul who could hear her truth. She did not weep, not even once, but she did write. Each night, beneath the light of a single oil lamp, she poured herself into the journal Clara had given her. Not in lament, but in testimony. Every word was a brick in the fortress of her own making. If no one believed her, then she would believe herself. And yet Clara, ever faithful, knew that silence was no protection in a world that devoured the innocent. So one afternoon, when the spring winds rose against the shutters and Agnes napped in the parlour, Clara took her small writing kit and composed a letter. She wrote to Edward Fairfax, the man who had once seen humanity in Lucian, the man who had always spoken with fairness, not spite. She kept it brief, respectful, honest. "She's not the woman they think she is," Clara wrote, "and he is not the man he could be without her." She sealed it with a ribbon, cut from Agnes's discarded hairband, and entrusted it to a boy who delivered eggs to the kitchen each week. She watched him ride into the trees, the letter tucked into his cap, and then turned back to the house with her apron twisted in her hands. Lucian received no reply from his investigators that week. Only more gossip. More silence. He began to walk the halls at night, pausing before Agnes's chamber door, now empty. He touched the doorknob once, but did not enter. The garden she had tended remained untouched. The lilies bloomed alone, their white petals bright as ghosts in the moonlight. And still, Agnes said nothing. Until the day a newspaper arrived with a new headline, bolder than the rest: "Redwick heir or bastard, Countess's silence fuels scandal." Lucian crumpled the paper in his fist, but the words had already been burned into him. Reputation, once the shield of his name, now weighed like iron around his neck. And somewhere beyond the trees and estates, beyond the glares and whispers, Agnes sat in a quiet room by an open window, one hand resting on her stomach, the other holding a pen. The wind moved through her hair like a lover's breath, soft and persistent. She did not know if anyone would fight for her, but she had not been silenced. Not yet. Elmswood stood wrapped in the quiet hush of late summer. The ivy that once clung wearily to its stone facade now shimmered with green life. Bees murmured in the lavender by the kitchen door, and the wind danced softly through the tall grass beyond the orchard. But inside the manor, time moved differently, measured not in hours or days, but in the rhythms of breath, pain, and prayer. Agnes laboured for 13 hours beneath the high-beamed ceiling of the old nursery chamber, once abandoned and now hastily prepared. Clara, pale but steady, stood beside her with cool cloths and whispered encouragements. An elderly midwife named Mrs. Rowley, brought from the neighbouring village, took command with practised calm, her voice grave and low, as the contractions deepened and the moans grew sharper. The storm outside had rolled in hours earlier, thunder echoing like cannon fire over the fields, but Agnes heard none of it. She was lost in her own storm, body arched, hands gripping the sheets, hair damp and clinging to her cheeks. The only anchor was the thought of the life she bore inside her, the child whom no one had wanted, the child whose very existence was a declaration, her child. When the final cry left her throat, ragged and trembling, it was met with a silence that lasted only a breath. Then a sound pierced the air. A cry, new and unspoiled, fierce in its first protest of the world. Agnes collapsed against the pillows, tears streaking her temples as Clara sobbed into her hands, and Mrs. Rowley wrapped the child in a flannel shawl. The midwife's voice, for once touched with reverence, broke the silence. "A boy," she said, "strong lungs. God's mercy, he's beautiful." Agnes reached out with trembling arms. When she held him for the first time, the world narrowed to that single moment. His face was flushed with life, his eyes tightly shut, his mouth still quivering from the effort of arrival. She traced a finger down the curve of his cheek and saw, without question, that he had Lucien's eyes, not just in shape, but in depth. The storm grey she had feared, loved, resisted. She pressed her lips to his brow and whispered, "You will never be invisible." For 3 days the house remained quiet. Agnes refused visitors, though none were expected. Word had already begun to spread, through stable boys, grocers, midwives' daughters, that the Countess of Redwick had given birth alone, far from London, far from her husband, far from the grandeur of the main estate, but not far from Grace. Clara wrote again to Edward Fairfax, her hand quick and pleading. "The child is here, healthy. The Count must come. He must see. If there is anything in him that still remembers truth, let it be now." Edward received the letter in London and wasted no time. That same night, he confronted Lucien in the study, where the fire burned too low and the wine glass in the Count's hand remained untouched. "She has given birth," Edward said, without ceremony. "A boy." Lucien looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "She claims it's mine," he said. Edward stepped forward. "She does not claim. She has never claimed anything that was not hers. And now she gives you a son, and you sit here among ashes and doubt." Lucien rose, voice low but taut. "You were not the one betrayed." "No," Edward said quietly, "but I am the one who still believes in her." The words stung. Lucien said nothing more. By dawn, he had left for Elmswood. The carriage arrived late in the afternoon. Agnes was in the nursery, rocking the baby gently while Clara adjusted the blankets. The air smelled of lavender and warm milk, the cradle beside her carved with faded rose motifs from some forgotten generation. When the door opened, she did not rise. Lucien entered without knocking, and the stillness in the room tightened like a rope drawn too fast. He looked thinner, wearier, but unchanged in his posture, straight-backed, composed, cold, until his eyes found the child, and in that instant, his world broke. The boy lay quietly in his mother's arms, his tiny fists curled against her collarbone, his cheek pressed against her shoulder. His dark lashes rested like brushstrokes on pale skin. Lucien stepped forward slowly. Agnes turned her head just slightly. "Do not speak unless it is to apologize." He stopped short. Her voice was ice, controlled, unwavering. "You sent me away," she said. "You called me a liar, a whore. You turned our child into a curse." Lucian's throat moved with difficulty. "I had no proof. You had my word." Her gaze met his, and there was no tremor in it. "And I would have carried this child in silence if it meant never seeing you again." He looked at the boy. The boy who bore his eyes, his jaw, his silence. "You never saw me," Agnes said, rising now, the child still nestled in her arms. "Not as a woman, not as a wife, not as a person capable of truth. And now you do not deserve to." The wind rattled the window panes. Lucian's voice, when it came, was hoarse. "He has my eyes." "No," she said. "He has my strength. What he has of you will remain to be seen." He reached out, almost without knowing it, to touch the child's arm. But Agnes turned away. "Do not touch what you would have cast aside," she whispered. He stood there for a long moment, unmoving. Then he nodded once, stiff, shallow, and left the room. Agnes did not watch him go. She held her son closer, kissed his brow, and whispered a promise only the child could hear. Elsewhere in a parlour that smelled of dried roses and old disdain, Lady Beatrice Redwick read the news with narrowed eyes. "A boy," she murmured. "How inconvenient." Her hand moved to her writing desk. Before the fire had time to dim, she had drafted 3 letters, one to her solicitor, one to a trusted magistrate, and one to the Montrose estate. If the child were to claim the Redwick name, he would have to earn it, and Beatrice intended to see to it that he did not. The fog had returned to London with a vengeance, rolling over cobblestone streets like a living thing, clinging to iron gates, veiling gas lamps in grey halos, muffling the sound of hooves and hurried footsteps. At Redwick House the windows remained shuttered despite the hour, and the hearth in the study burned too low for warmth. Lucian sat motionless before it, his back stiff, his fingers laced tightly beneath his chin. He had not slept in 2 days. The journal lay before him, not his, not hers, but the one Clara had brought, trembling, eyes cast low as she placed it on his desk without asking permission. "She never wanted you to see it," she had whispered. "But she never thought you would need it either." He had ignored it for hours, even as the fire shrank to embers. But eventually, alone and unable to silence the storm in his chest, he had opened the pages. What he found inside did not soothe him. It undid him. Agnes's handwriting was precise, elegant, unhurried. Each entry was a mirror turned toward her soul. Words written without audience or expectation, absent of bitterness, but full of ache. She had written of the walls of Redwick, of the way they seemed to tighten around her with every silent dinner, every absent gaze. She had chronicled the garden's return to life, the touch of soil beneath her fingertips, the way the lilies had bloomed without asking for permission. She had written about him, and never once with hate. She had written of the moment he turned his back at the ball, of the crushed glass, of the rain that clung to her cheeks in the garden, indistinguishable from tears, of the kiss that felt like a wound, opening instead of healing, of the child she carried without permission, without blessing, and how she chose, despite everything, to love it. He closed the journal with trembling fingers. Shame, long a stranger to him, sat heavy on his chest. Lucian Redwick, the man of unbreakable lineage and unshakable resolve, found himself hollowed by the revelation that the woman he had dismissed, disbelieved, and exiled had been the only honest voice in a world built on masks. And the world was watching now. Lady Beatrice had done precisely what she promised. The court summons had been swift, the allegations precise. She questioned the child's legitimacy, citing Lucian's own words, his refusal, his absence, his inquiries. She whispered of servants' gossip, of village midwives, of stained names and stained blood. The court would hear it all, and Agnes would stand alone unless someone stood beside her. On the morning of the hearing, Lucian arrived late. The courtroom, a stately chamber carved in dark oak and red velvet, was filled with the rustle of silk and scandal. Lords and ladies lined the benches, their expressions composed but eager, like hawks watching a dove fall from the sky. Agnes stood at the front, her back straight, her chin high. She wore a modest gown of deep burgundy wool, unadorned but regal in its simplicity. Her hair was coiled at the nape of her neck, her eyes steady. In her arms, she held the child. The boy rested quietly, unaware that his name, his inheritance, and his very right to exist within a world of marble halls and family crests was being dissected by gloved hands and cold eyes. Agnes spoke little, but when she did, the room fell silent. "I will not offer proof to those who doubted me before they even saw me," she said, voice clear as church bells. "I will not parade my son as evidence. I will not plead. What I carried was not shame. What I carry now is justice. And if that is not enough, then let history remember who stood and who turned away." Beatrice rose, her voice sharp, her posture proud. She quoted precedent. She read statements. She painted Agnes with words like brush-strokes dipped in poison. Lucian said nothing. "Not yet." Then the magistrate asked, "Is there no one to speak for the father?" All heads turned, the air crackled, and then he rose. Lucian walked slowly to the front of the chamber. Every eye followed him. Whispers rippled like silk. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at Agnes. When he spoke, his voice did not tremble. "I am the child's father," he said, "and he is my heir." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Beatrice's fan dropped from her hand. Lucian turned toward the magistrate. "I abandoned them, not in truth but in fear. My pride was louder than her honesty, my doubts louder than her silence. I see now what I refused to see before." He turned again, to the audience this time, to the name that mattered more than all others, to the Countess of Redwick, who carried my child while I carried my arrogance. Gasps echoed like wind through the chamber. Agnes said nothing, but her arms, wrapped around the child, tightened. And that was enough. The court, unwilling to challenge the Count's public acknowledgement, dismissed the case with a nod from the magistrate and a strike of his gavel. The child was declared legitimate, the matter closed. Beatrice did not speak as she left, but the set of her mouth foretold battles not yet buried. After the hearing, Lucian did not follow Agnes. He walked instead to the chapel at the edge of the estate, an old stone building wrapped in ivy and quiet sorrow. Inside, the air was cool and musty. Candles flickered before a row of carved saints. He stood before the portrait of his mother, whose eyes had watched over him since childhood, stern, knowing, unforgiving. He stared for a long time. "What did you see in me?" he murmured. "And what have I become?" The echo of his voice returned to him like a prayer no one dared answer. For the first time in years, Lucian Redwyk sank to his knees, not before law, nor blood, nor legacy, but before truth. Not for forgiveness, but for the strength to earn it. Winter arrived early that year. The frost crept in before the last leaves had fully surrendered their gold, and Redwyk Hall stood beneath a sky of pewter, still and unspeaking. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air held its promise, sharp and dry, like the silence between two people who once shared a breath. Agnes returned just after Michaelmas, but not to the same house, and not as the same woman. She came not in a grand carriage, nor to ceremony. No servants were summoned to line the steps. Her arrival passed quietly, as though Redwyk itself feared drawing attention to what it had once cast away. She brought only Clara, her son wrapped in blankets against the chill, and a trunk of things she had not touched since the day she had been dismissed. Lucian did not greet her. He had not requested her return, nor had he written. The court had made its declaration, and Agnes, ever dignified, had obeyed the finality of its ruling with the same calm she had shown in the courtroom, unwavering and proud. Her rooms were not in the East Wing, where she had once slept alone in a bed too vast for comfort, nor in the marital chambers, which remained locked and untouched. Instead, she and the child were given a suite near the old nursery, rooms with faded wallpaper of roses and swans, windows that overlooked the frost-bitten orchard, and a fireplace that Clara lit each morning with devotion. Here, Agnes lived not as a wife, but as a mother. Each morning she bathed her son in warm water, scented with chamomile. She rocked him by the fire and whispered lullabies no one had ever sung to her. She spoke to him not of titles or expectations, but of kindness, of truth, of gardens reborn from neglect. And each evening, when he slept, she wrote entries that no longer chronicled sorrow, but memory, hope, and the quiet, uncertain beauty of beginning again. Lucien did not intrude, not at first, but he was there. Agnes saw him in the garden one morning, standing beside the lilies she had once coaxed back to life. He did not wear gloves. His coat was dusted with frost. He stood with his hands behind his back, staring at the flowers with a stillness that was not his usual coldness, but something more uncertain, contained. The next day, he was there again, and the day after. He never approached her, never asked to see the child, but something about the shape of him in the distance, the way his breath misted in the cold air, spoke of a man unmoored. One afternoon, as Agnes walked slowly among the hedges, her son pressed against her chest in a wool sling, Lucien passed her on the path. He did not stop, but he removed his hat, a small gesture, an old one. But for Agnes, it cracked something just enough to let the wind in. She continued walking. It was Clara who noticed it first, the way the staff no longer avoided Agnes's gaze, the way the cook, who once served her cold broth in silence, now left warm bread wrapped in cloth outside her door. "There's a softness returning," Clara said one morning, brushing the snow from the nursery window. "Not much, but enough to notice." Agnes only nodded. She did not need softness, but she welcomed the honesty in it. Lucien's actions came quietly, without announcement, without praise. The orphanage Agnes had once supported with her dowry, abandoned and shuttered after her exile, received new funds. The roof was mended, shoes were purchased. A new teacher arrived from Leeds. The tenants she had visited in secret now received letters with Lucien's own seal, letters written in his hand, asking what repairs were needed, what crops had failed, what aid was required. The house steward, long known for his cruelty to maids and indifference to suffering, was dismissed without explanation. His replacement was a younger man, gentle in speech, deliberate in justice. Agnes learned of these things not from Lucien, but from Clara, from the tenants themselves, and from the changed expressions of those who moved through the halls. Lucien never came to the nursery, until one evening just before Christmas. Agnes had just laid her son in his cradle, the fire casting soft orange light across his cheeks. Snow tapped lightly against the window panes. The room smelled of milk and beeswax, and somewhere in the distance, a choir from the village church rehearsed hymns that floated through the night like incense. She turned to leave, and stopped. Lucien was there, asleep in the chair beside the cradle, his coat still on, his boots damp with melted snow. His head had fallen back against the cushion, his mouth slightly parted, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. She froze. The sight was so unexpected, so quietly vulnerable, that she could not move. He had come, and not to confront nor command, but to keep watch. The clock struck 11. Still, he slept. Agnes sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers folded in her lap, her gaze resting not on him, but on the child who now breathed evenly beneath the woolen blanket. Safe, warm, alive. She did not wake Lucien. But for the first time, she did not shut the door behind her. The next morning, he was gone. But a fresh fire had been lit in the nursery. The room was warmer. Later that week, Agnes found him in the garden again. This time she approached. He looked up. She did not speak. He held out a small parcel, bound in brown paper, tied with string. No seal. Agnes took it. Inside was a copy of The Gardener's Year by William Robinson. A second-hand edition, pages worn, the corners folded, a note inside in his hand. "You taught the earth to bloom again. May it never forget your hands." She did not thank him, but she kept the book. That same afternoon, Clara found Lucien alone by the rose wall, pruning shears in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbow. "You can't rebuild what's broken," she said softly, "by planting flowers over the cracks." He turned. His face was worn, older somehow. "I know." "Then stop trying to undo what's done," she said gently. "Start living with it. Let her see you, not the Count, the man." Lucian looked down at the rose bush, then back at her, and nodded. That night, Agnes returned to the nursery late. She held her son longer than usual, humming to him with a voice that trembled. Outside, Redwyke slept beneath a thin blanket of snow. Inside, something thawed, not fully, not yet, but enough for spring to know it would be welcomed when it came. Spring returned to Redwyke House, not merely with the bloom of flowers or the song of birds, but with something far rarer, a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. The heavy silence that had long haunted its halls began to give way to laughter, to warmth, to life. What frost had claimed in pride, the sun now gently reclaimed in grace. The fete was announced 2 weeks before Easter, a celebration for the tenants, Lucian had said, a gesture of gratitude for their loyalty through a season of uncertainty. But to those who had long watched from the periphery, it was clear that something deeper stirred beneath the surface, something that had less to do with duty and more to do with atonement. Preparations transformed the estate. Bunting was hung along the hedgerows, lanterns suspended from every tree in the garden that Agnes had once coaxed back to life with her own hands. Tables were draped in linen, laid with fresh bread, honey, and preserves. Musicians were hired from the village, and children ran barefoot across the newly trimmed lawns, shrieking with delight. It was not the kind of gathering Redwyke had ever known. Gone were the nobles and their polished disdain. In their place stood men in worn coats, women with calloused hands, mothers nursing infants, and old farmers blinking in awe at the bounty spread before them. And in the heart of it all stood Agnes. She wore a gown of soft lavender muslin, simple yet elegant, the sleeves gathered modestly at the wrists. Her dark hair swept back into a low twist adorned with small white blooms. Her presence did not demand attention, yet every gaze found her. Not because she sought it, but because something in her stillness commanded reverence. Lucian watched from the steps. He had dressed plainly. No cravat, no medals, only a deep navy coat and trousers that bore a trace of the morning's dust from walking the grounds. His expression, so long carved from marble, was open now, uncertain, humbled. As the afternoon waned into dusk, a hush swept through the crowd. Lucian stepped forward, holding a small scroll tied with a green ribbon. Agnes, near the garden's fountain, turned, but did not move toward him. "My friends," Lucian began, his voice steady but low, "Redwyke has long been a place of tradition, of lineage, of names written in ledgers and remembered in portraits." There was a murmur of agreement, polite and distant. "But names mean nothing," he continued, eyes now finding Agnes's, "if they are not earned, if they are not lived with truth, with courage, with compassion." Silence followed. He unraveled the scroll. "This garden, once left to ruin, has flourished not by command, but by the quiet persistence of a woman who saw life where others saw decay. Today, I rededicate it in her name. From this day forward, it shall be known as the Ashworth Garden." Gasps broke through the crowd. Agnes did not speak. Her eyes shimmered. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Lucian swallowed hard. "There is more." He turned to a small boy, no more than 18 months, held in Clara's arms. The child, with dark hair and eyes impossibly like his father's, clutched a red silk ribbon tied around a wooden toy horse. Lucian knelt. He opened a small box. Inside gleamed a silver signet ring engraved with the Redwyke crest. "This is for my son," he said, voice breaking. "Born not of expectation, but of defiance, of faith, of love not yet spoken. Let it be known that this child is mine, my heir, the future Earl of Redwyke." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Several tenants clapped softly, then louder, until the entire garden echoed with applause. Agnes remained still. Lucian rose slowly and walked toward her, the crowd falling away. The lanterns had been lit, casting a golden glow across the hedgerows and blossoms. The scent of lilac and wood smoke filled the air. The garden pulsed with life. Yet in that moment, all faded into silence. Lucian stopped before her. "I once thought a name was everything," he said, voice thick. "That bloodlines, alliances, and appearances were the only things worth guarding." Agnes stared at him. Her face bore no hatred now, only a sorrowful knowing. "I married you out of pride," he said, barely above a whisper. "But I kneel to you now, out of devotion." And then, slowly, deliberately, Lucian sank to one knee in the soil she had once tilled. "I have wounded you," he said. "I have doubted what I should have cherished. I cannot rewrite what I did, Agnes. But I can spend every day proving I have changed, not with words, but with how I choose to live, with how I choose to love." She shook her head, a single tear falling. "This isn't about love," she said quietly. "It's about trust." "I know," he replied, "and I will earn it, not by asking, but by standing here, until you see not the man who broke you, but the one willing to be broken, if only to begin again." The silence stretched between them like a string drawn taut. Then a small noise. Their son had toddled forward, breaking free from Clara's arms, clutching the wooden horse to his chest. He stood between them, wide-eyed and unsteady, then lifted his tiny hand, first to his mother, then to his father. Agnes looked down at him, at the miracle born from ruin, at the innocence that bore no weight of betrayal. She reached for his hand, and in doing so, her fingers brushed Lucian's. It was not a grand gesture. No kiss, no proclamation, only a touch, a beginning. Lucian rose slowly, taking her hand in both of his. He did not pull her to him, he did not rush, but she did not let go. Above them the lanterns swayed. Around them the garden bloomed, and within them something rooted deep and true, born not from perfection, but from the courage to face imperfection together. Agnes did not say she forgave him. She did not need to. She was still here, not as a wife chosen by convenience, but as the woman seen at last. As the wife who had chosen herself, and at last, a love that had chosen to grow. Redwyck House, summer of 1870. The sun hung low over the rolling hills of Somerset, casting a golden veil over the stone walls and ivy-clad turrets of Redwyck House. The once cold estate now hummed with life. Laughter echoed across the gardens, where once only silence reigned. The fountains trickled softly, and roses, deep crimson and soft blush, climbed the trellises Agnes had planted with her own hands. From the window of the nursery, a boy of 6 watched the late afternoon unfold. His name was Henry Ashworth Redwyck, and though he bore the title of Viscount and heir to a vast fortune, he was more interested in chasing butterflies than learning Latin. He had his father's eyes, solemn and questioning, and his mother's quiet resilience. His favorite place in the world was between his parents, one hand in each of theirs. Agnes sat beneath the elm tree that shaded the Ashworth garden. She wore a gown of soft blue cotton, simple and unadorned, her dark hair streaked now with threads of silver at the temples. In her lap slept a second child, a girl no older than 4, her curls a rich chestnut, and her cheeks dappled with summer freckles. Lucian stood nearby, hands folded behind his back, watching them with a look he once never allowed himself to wear, tenderness unguarded. He was older now, yes, but gentler too. The furrows in his brow had softened. His voice, once so clipped, now carried warmth even in silence. His transformation had not come in a single sweeping gesture, but in the dailiness of showing up, of kneeling beside Agnes as she wept in childbirth again, of reading bedtime stories aloud in the very room where his own mother once wept for lack of affection. The name Redwyck had changed in meaning. It no longer stood for pride or lineage alone, but for repair, for atonement, for legacy reshaped by humility. Lady Beatrice never returned to Redwyck after the court scandal. Her attempt to have Henry declared illegitimate had been a social death sentence. She retreated to a cousin's estate in Yorkshire and, though still alive, lived in quiet bitterness, surrounded by servants too afraid to speak and portraits of ancestors who would never speak back. She had paid dearly, not only in status, but in the love of the family she once claimed to protect. Edward Fairfax visited often. He never married. Some whispered he had loved Agnes in silence, though none dared speak it aloud. Agnes herself never confirmed it, nor denied it. Their bond remained strong, but always honourable. Edward became godfather to little Rose, Agnes and Lucian's daughter, and on Sundays he would walk her through the chapel gardens, telling her stories of courage, of justice, of choosing kindness even when it hurt. Clara stayed on, of course. She had become more than a maid. She was family now. It was Clara who taught Henry to write his name, who held Agnes's hand when the labour with Rose grew too long. It was Clara who wept the day Agnes was officially named Lady of the Estate, her title restored not by royal decree, but by the people of Redwick themselves, through letters, petitions, and the undying gratitude of those whose lives she had quietly transformed. Society had changed too, perhaps not entirely, but enough. Women spoke more boldly in drawing rooms now. The gossip columns, once cruel, began to admire rather than mock. The tale of the barren wife who bore an heir had become a legend, retold in whispers with awe and wonder. And while Lucian's name was still feared in the House of Lords, it was now spoken with a touch of reverence, for the way he had bowed to love instead of pride, to redemption instead of reputation. And Agnes remained steady. She did not hunger for society's approval, nor fear its scorn. She wrote, quietly and often. Journals filled shelves in the library, not of scandals, but of growth, of healing, of the slow work of rebuilding love once shattered. She had long ago burned the first journal, the one written in pain, but she kept the ashes. Pressed between the pages of her newest volume, they served as a reminder that even what is reduced to ash may nourish something beautiful if given time. That evening, as lanterns flickered to life along the garden path, Lucian approached where Agnes sat with Rose still sleeping in her lap. He knelt beside them, as he had years before, and placed a soft kiss on her wrist. "She's so much like you," he said, brushing a curl from Rose's forehead. Agnes looked down at the child, then over to Henry chasing fireflies beneath the archway of roses. "And yet," she murmured, "they will never know who we were before, only who we chose to become." Lucian smiled faintly. "That is a mercy," he said, "and a gift." Largish sun, they sat in silence as the sun slipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the Ashworth garden. Love, Agnes had learned, was not a single moment of forgiveness or a dramatic declaration beneath lantern light. It was the quiet choosing, again and again, to remain, to trust, to open one's heart not to what had been promised, but to what had been earned. And so, in the house once haunted by silence, the walls now echoed with children's laughter. And in the garden once left to ruin, love bloomed again, with roots deep, branches wide, and blossoms touched always by memory. Agnes closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, not for more riches or recognition, but simply for more time to walk this path she once thought would end in sorrow. It had led instead to a beginning. If you've made it this far, dear viewer, then you've walked every shadowed hallway of Redwick House, stood beneath the lanterns in the garden, and held your breath as Agnes dared to rise from the ashes of silence. Her story is not only one of love, but of dignity reclaimed, of quiet strength defying judgment, and of a woman who was never truly seen, until she refused to disappear. Agnes Ashworth taught us something powerful, that what others call weakness can be the source of deepest resilience. That love, when built on respect and not pride, can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the words, "I believe in myself." Lucian, once a man bound by reputation, found redemption not in grand gestures, but in the slow and steady work of becoming worthy of love. And in that transformation, we are reminded, no one is too far gone to change. We would love to know what touched your heart most in this story. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you've journeyed all the way to the end, write the word resilience below. That way, we'll know you felt every beat of this tale, and you'll help others discover it too. If this story moved you, and you'd like to support the passionate team behind these historical romances, you're warmly invited to send a super thanks right here on YouTube. Any amount you feel called to give will help us keep telling stories that stir the soul and honor forgotten voices. But if a donation isn't possible, don't worry. Your support means the world in many forms. Sharing this video with friends, family, or fellow lovers of period drama is another beautiful way to help our little corner of the storytelling world grow. And if your heart still longs for more, don't go far. We've added similar stories in the cards at the end of this video. Tales of brave women, complicated men, and love that burns even in the coldest winters. Thank you, from the depths of our hearts, for being part of Agnes's journey. May her courage stay with you long after the screen fades to black.